I wanted to begin our course with a brief overview and introduction to English for specific purposes. This is to give you a foundation of how to view the theories and approaches that we're going to look at for this session. First and foremost, we want to think about the beginning of ESP as both a concept and a set of approaches that we use in ELT or in TESOL teaching in terms of how we thought about this as a specific need for our learners. Now, Hutchinson's and Waters identify that the need for learning very specific language for vocabulary in science, technology, and business after World War II. And this is because we had a lot of folks finally coming together in a global community to discuss and talk about the different features of a particular project, the research that was going on, the socioeconomic things that were happening in the world, as well as kind of the logistical things like engineering, building, and putting things into practice. This means that English had to be targeted to allow those people to communicate in an English work-related process. Now, ESP in and of itself isn't just about a specific goal being accomplished, but allowing people the linguistic resources that they needed to achieve that goal. So the main factors for the emergence and development of ESP were that people were using English now as the lingua franca. It was the dominant language of the world because of these specific conditions that happened socioculturally, logistically, as well as economically in the world to allow people to communicate and achieve their goals together. Now, professional language requirements mean that people are in this now interconnected society. So different organizations, whether they be economic, political, social, were starting to use English as the common language among them in a global sense. It also meant that these professional requirements made it so that they had to have a specific knowledge set. So they were experts in their field, but not necessarily in English. So we had to create that bridge for them to understand how things work together. The new research then started to be found in linguistics and psychology because we had to not just connect to the language, but we also had to think about the social factors that influence the way people thought about their communication. So this means that with that and with the trends in language education that were happening at the same time, we shifted from a teacher-centeredness to a learner or student-focused instruction. So it was less of that rote memorization and more of, okay, how do we handle this situation? So the basic tenets then of ESP are meant to be a responsive set of approaches. This means we are looking at the immediate demands of the learner or set of learners to what they are required to do at this point. That means the courses themselves have to be designed for communication. Then it might be that communication is limited to a very specific set of conditions or interactions or for a limited amount of time. So it may be that folks are learning English in a very quick, fast-paced environment so that they're able to attend to the needs of something that's going to happen very soon. This isn't necessarily the same as what we would do for EFL, which is we're looking at the long-term learning. This might be short term in the sense that there's something that has to be urgently addressed. That means the content then is very fixed to that specific group of learners you're working with. You're not creating something general that anybody can use, though you can kind of consider creating basic skeletons of your structure for your curriculum or what you're going to do for in terms of activities or the approaches that you are going to apply to any given context, but the overall content, how you develop and you modify your approaches for that moment is very specific to a small group of people. Now, when we think about the broad objectives as Baskertman had acknowledged, is that we have to kind of think about what ESP teaching is trying to do. So first, we're trying to develop the student's knowledge of disciplinary concepts and the language skills needed to communicate those disciplinary concepts. So this means if we're going to, for example, be talking about English for engineering practices, um, those purposes within their engineering situation might be, I have to communicate with a technological partner to my own company, and how do we communicate the needs of what I need to build this thing. So we have to talk about the collaborative language that they might need. We have to talk about clarification language. And within that, we need to know enough about the technology that they're working with to be able to accurately give them authentic materials to work with. We also have to think about how the classroom is the appropriate place for them to learn. So we don't want them to be doing language trial and error in urgent or in high, I would, how we, kind of what we put this in high risk situations or high stakes situations. We want to make sure that we give them all the tools that they need to negotiate within their English language context in the classroom. So that means we have to kind of think ahead of what they might experience and prepare them with the tools that allow them to be flexible with their language, but also be as communicative as possible. And last, we have to provide that background knowledge that is part of the underlying competencies. So as I mentioned before, our students might be experts in their particular fields, but they may not be experts in the English language communication process, vocabulary, structure, cultural negotiation that they might have in their first or native language. We want to give them that opportunity to expand that. We have to provide the background. We have to tell them why this might happen, what to look for, what the cues look like, and how turn taking and negotiation might happen. ESP itself is just one of the branches of English language teaching, and whether it falls under English foreign language teaching, English as lingua franca, English as something, it is still a branch of the language teaching that we do. Now, as we look at this particular chart, this one is the tree of ELT that a lot of us have learned from a long, long time ago. But it's about the approaches that we take being branches of one thing or another. Now, typically we see like EOP, which is English for occupational purposes, versus EAP as subdivisions of English for specific purposes. So you'll notice EOP is often tied to a job or an occupation or a field of study, whereas English for academic purposes can be overlapping in those things, but they can also be related to just general language learning as a second language learner. English for social sciences then is another branch of EOP, whether we're looking at like the idea of how we understand teaching itself. So those of us who are English language teachers as native speakers of English versus those of us who are English language teachers who have been apart from that, you have to spend some time as you go through also learning English for psychology and teaching purposes. So this is something that you've already experienced and done because you were already an expert in teaching. Now we just have this extra set of competencies and skills that you develop in that sense. But we also have the English for business and economic purposes, English for technicians, for medical studies, for economics. All of these are a part of that umbrella of ESP. To kind of break that down a little bit more simply, English language teaching is broken into linguistics, literature, and specific purposes. So linguistics, of course, looks at form as well as the sociocultural factors around language as it's formed. Literature looks at the creative and cultural aspects of the language within the written word or within texts such as movies, songs, arts, fashion, anything else that could be considered a text. And then, of course, specific purposes, which is why we are here. Under specific purposes, of course, we have the branches of academic versus professional. Now, these two are not exclusive as this chart kind of makes it seem. They overlap a little bit depending on the field itself, as well as the level of academic language required in each of those professional fields. But what we can see is that once we have the professional side, the EO for occupational purposes, the EOP, then it breaks down into, for example, if it's business, there are different branches of business. If it's sciences, the different branches of sciences, and so on. So we always want to kind of think about ESP is always under the umbrella of everything else that we apply to TESOL and ELT language teaching. They just get more and more specific the farther down the branches we go. So we want to kind of think about those areas then as ways for us to kind of think about the divisions, what our limitations are, where our boundaries lie in terms of what we should be thinking about in terms of ESP, because we could complicate our students' lives by saying, here are all of the different ways that this connects to this other branch. This is also a way for us to kind of check and verify that the content that we're creating is valid and useful. So Basterman had divided it into the EAP, EPP, EOP. I tend to feel like some of the professional purposes could also be branched under occupational purposes and so on. And that's a lot of what most recent literature will also say. Now, in terms of course design, some of the main studies that we should pay attention to are, of course, Hutchinson and Waters that we've already mentioned, where we talk about student needs. And this is something where we hopefully will get into a lot more about needs analysis, and that being the absolute first place to start whenever we do any kind of ESP course design is figuring out who our students are, what language needs they have, what critical needs they have in a functional sense, timelines, all of this kind of thing in terms of what students' needs has to be applied to the course that we create. We also have to think about the learning models. So this is the different approaches and the ways that we introduce the content as well as the practice that the students will be engaged in, as well as ways of describing language. So we have to think about their context to be able to help them see the sociocultural factors behind what we're teaching them and why we are teaching them those pieces of content. The next is with Dudley, Evans, and St. John from 1998. This is when we're thinking more about the context as well. So students' needs is definitely about context, but it's mostly looking at the individual learners and what the outcomes are supposed to be. But with the Dudley, Evans, and St. John, we're talking more about the student identity themselves. So this is, what discipline are they in? What's the actual student identity that we have to kind of remember? So this is, what's the situation? Are we teaching them within an educational setting, or is it in a professional setting? How old are your students? Because that could be something where they might feel a little bit displaced from language learning, so we have to kind of maybe embed what they're doing differently than a normal classroom setting and maybe more into the practical side of what they do, as well as their social status. So again, this could be something where they may feel resistant, or they may feel they have their own set of deficits if they've been away from learning for too long, or if they feel they're too far down the social hierarchy to need this kind of content that you're giving them, or that they feel a lot of pressure to engage with the content in a certain way. We also want to think about their proficiency level. This may or may not be related to their learning styles or their proficiencies in terms of being a learner. This just could be maybe someone has been away from English language learning long enough that they have forgotten everything. Or you might have someone who's recently been in school and they've had to have English language learning in that space, and they might be a little bit more proficient than someone around them. So do definitely take into account who they are as a person. With Fortnina, Gomez, and Ryerson, what we want to kind of think about then is, number one, what their nationality is, because that could affect the sociocultural aspects of their learning. Their experiences as a learner, so what kind of emotional barriers might be there, as well as language proximity. And this could be something where different varieties of English were more present in their language learning in the past, and that might affect how they communicate or how they learn, or how they are adapting to the content that you're giving. And last, with basketmen at foregrounds, the three major points in one's professional career: that pre-experience, during experience, post-experience. Now, this applies to both you and your students. So this is what you know, how you understand it, going through different examples, but it might be something as well with your students. They might be at the very beginning of their careers. They might be college students who are in that field and you're teaching them how to use English language in that field. The during experience, this means that they have, they're in the moment, they are probably trying to learn this as fast as they can for a specific situation. Or post experience, they've come back and realized that they were not as prepared as they thought they would be to engage in the English communicative environment. When we think about resources then for ESP, we also have to think about where we get the content, how we develop the content. So as I've mentioned before, needs analysis is going to be a place where we derive information and guidance from our students themselves. So what is it that they have to know? They probably already have an idea, and they can give you a lot of input to help direct, tailor, and fine-tune the content that you're creating. You also want to look to the professionals that are in those fields, occupations, or practices. So one thing that as an ESP practitioner you will discover is that you will suddenly have to become an expert in something you never expected. So, for example, one of the experiences that I've had as an ESP professional was working with a group of medical researchers who were specific to stem cell research in diabetes treatment. They were Japanese doctors at a medical university. All of them were residents, so they had high sets of knowledge and skill. They just needed a little help to kind of talk about their research. But their leadership realized that they were going to be collaborating with another group of researchers from Saudi Arabia. So they were going to Saudi Arabia to go to this conference and go to this professional event, and the leadership realized that they had a really hard time with small talk. So part of it was helping them develop elevator speeches, helping them think about the social cues and aspects of being in a social environment in Saudi Arabia, as well as how do I do that in English? So I had to think about how they gave their professional presentations. What did that require? And that was going to be in English. English was the lingua franca of the conference in Saudi Arabia. So that was a professional sphere. That felt much easier than trying to help them with the elevator speeches and being able to field questions, uh, as well as the social aspect, because a lot of folks in Saudi Arabia spend their K through 12 learning British English, and then maybe their college career is in American English. So there's a lot of kind of mixtures there with just the language variety. But then thinking about the social norms of an event like that in Saudi Arabia, where they have to kind of talk about, number one, the elevator speech, but also themselves personally, because that's the conversational level that happens there. So what is it that they're trying to do? And that meant that the leadership knew exactly what would be expected of them, gave me a set of parameters to work with, gave me the sets of vocabulary to kind of describe the research as well as the personal side of it, and we spent several months just preparing them for this particular event. There are also designated textbooks that are for English for specific purposes. Many times publishers will allow you to order desk copies of certain textbooks to help you in developing your curriculum. We always want to think about the current research in linguistics and related fields as well. So the Journal of English for Specific Purposes, ESPJ, World Englishes, the TESOL.org journals, all of these have great resources, have specific, if they're not specifically dedicated to ESP, like for example, TESOL.org has specific threads that focus on ESP, and these are great places to see what's happening, to see what people have done, how people have approached it, and kind of take those and use those as examples. So during the course this session, I'll be looking at your responses to kind of help maybe guide you and give you additional optional readings or resources that would be useful. And of course, online. So As I mentioned before, TESOL.org is a great organization to uh, look up and to maybe become a member of if you are not already a student member of TESOL. To join the discussion groups, to get access to online training, to look at the discussion threads, to go to conferences. A lot of those different organizations are great for that. We also have AZ TESOL if you are locally here in Arizona, as well as social networks. Within Facebook, we have Facebook groups for ESP. There are different Instagram accounts that focus on ESP, and if you guys want, I am happy to share those with you guys. There are also podcasts, YouTube channels, and other Google videos that talk about ESP and how to apply it in different spaces.